Good afternoon. For those of you just joining us, welcome to the 2019 Lutheran Studies Conference. My name is Dr. Merritt Trelstad, University Chair of Lutheran Studies. Now please, if you will, take a moment to silence your cell phones and prepare for a wonderful afternoon panel. Reverend Jen Rood serves as our university pastor here at PLU and will be facilitating this great panel today. Prior to PLU, Jen served as pastor in a Lutheran congregation with an interfaith nonprofit working with young people experiencing homelessness and LGBTQ youth, and with a national organization providing support and advocacy for LGBTQ Lutheran pastors and seminarians, all while living in Chicago. She will be introducing our panelists today for our session titled, Why Sex? Engaging religion and spirituality with the whys and the what-fors of sex. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Rood.
Thanks, Merritt. Thank you, panelists. So when I was a preteen, my well-intentioned, loving Lutheran Christian parents sat me down for the sex talk. Oh, yeah. I've blocked out most of the details of that super awkward conversation, but two things I remember. One, my older sister rolling her eyes because it was going to be a family conversation and she would rather die. And two, that afterwards my parents gave me a set of cassette tapes to listen to on my own. Nice. Mind you, CDs had already been invented. So this was old school, even back then. So these tapes were about sex and sexuality from some Christian publishing house. A husband and wife spoke in soft tones and flowery God language about sex. What I remember most about those sex tapes What I remember most about those sex tapes was that they were very logistical, spelling out the mechanics of sex, which I admit was helpful to dispel some of the myths acquired in middle school. There certainly was other stuff in there about our bodies as God's creation and the importance of love and mutuality as part of sex. However, I wasn't really all that captivated by it, and to be honest, I never finished listening to the whole set. And no one ever brought them up again. Fast forward to my first year of college, when I kiss a woman for the first time and come out as queer. And I don't really count my first girl kiss, which took place at Lutheran summer camp. We were just really good friends. Anyway, after that kiss, suddenly all my factual knowledge about sex was completely useless. And even though I never finished those cassette tapes, I felt quite certain that they would not have prepared me for this scenario. And yet, in some ways, my Lutheran faith had completely prepared me for figuring out queer sex. From my faith communities and parents, I had absorbed the messages of God's grace, love of God, neighbor, and self, and a justice lens that found a ready and willing home in my budding queer activist heart. And I feel eternally grateful that because of my faith communities, when I came out, I still believed in God's love for me, for my sexuality, and for my relationships. Now, don't get me wrong. This does not mean that I was not super messy for a while, as I figured out how to embody these values as a young queer woman. And my relationship with the church had plenty of tension. And over again, I was disappointed by its actions. And maybe even more so, its inactions. Thankfully, God was a support during these challenging times with the church, and not an additional barrier. I felt held by God, even when I felt the church dropping me. But mostly in all this, I really could have used some more conversation partners. to help me navigate this messy middle between logistics and good theology. This messy middle where most of life happens. And that's where we're diving in today with this fantastic panel. Faith communities are notorious for spending time and energy on who should or should not be having sex, based on the doctrines and norms of that particular tradition and culture. Criteria about who should or should not be having sex often have to do with gender or sexuality or marital status. Logistics. But not a lot of attention is placed on the why and the what for. Why do people have sex? What is sex for? Why is there a thing called sex at all? And what does any of this sex talk have to do with God and religion and faith and spirituality? I think those are interesting questions, and I hope you do too, because that's what we're going to talk about. So I've asked each panelist to share for about 5 minutes on these questions from their particular faith traditions and intersectional identities. And then after each person has shared, we'll have time to take questions from the audience. Heads up, we're going to ask for student questions first. So students, start writing your questions down. I'm going to briefly introduce each panelist before they speak, and their full bios are available on the website. So we're going to begin with Rabbi Bruce Cadden, who's the rabbi of Temple Beth El in Tacoma and an adjunct professor in the religion department here at PLU and part of the faculty of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. He's also a partner chaplain here at PLU. He and his wife Barbara, of blessed memory, are authors of 3 books in Jewish education.
So I'm pretty sure that this is only the second time in my more than 38 years as a rabbi that I've been asked to speak about sex. And the first time was to a group of Jewish teenagers, so I trust you're an easier audience. In one of the most surprising Jewish texts, the Jerusalem Talmud teaches that on Judgment Day, we will be called to account for those pleasures we had the opportunity to enjoy, but did not. Of course, the pleasures are limited to those permitted by Jewish law, but it still reminds us that God's world is here for us to enjoy. With regard to sex, conversations in Judaism often begin with the first mitzvah, the first sacred obligation in the Torah. After creating the first human beings, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and master it, and rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every living thing that moves on earth." We'll set aside for now the problems with mastering the earth and ruling over the animals and focus on what it means to be fruitful and multiply. Interestingly, Judaism interprets this passage to mean that men are obligated to father 2 children, at least one of whom is male. And the same obligation technically is not placed upon women. But Genesis also includes 2 other teachings that offer another take on our relationships. In the second creation story, after creating a male being, God says, "It is not good for the man to be alone." And after creating a woman, the text concludes, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Based on these teachings, Judaism affirmed 2 reasons for marriage: procreation and companionship. If for whatever reason a couple is not able to bear children, the relationship is still meaningful and valid. In developing the ketubah, the Jewish wedding document, the rabbi said that a husband has 3 obligations to his wife. She'erah, which is providing sustenance or food; kisutah, literally clothing, but by implication providing lodging for her; and onatah, providing conjugal relations. These obligations are derived from Exodus 21:10 that says that if a husband takes a second wife, he is still obligated to his first wife in these 3 matters. In those days, that was fine. The first two terms in the ketubah are straightforward, but there is much debate about the third term, onatah. But the consensus is that it does refer to conjugal relations, and the Talmud makes explicit what those obligations are. For men of independent means, every day. for laborers twice a week, for donkey drivers once a week, for camel drivers once in 30 days, and for sailors once in 6 months. In other words, depending on one's occupational limitations determines on your obligation to pleasing one's wife. We might guess where university professors, students, and administrators and others fit into this progression. What is most remarkable is that the rabbis recognized a regular obligation of a husband to his wife, regardless of whether she is able to become pregnant or not. Of course, women who are menstruating are forbidden to have intercourse with their husband during their period and for 7 days after. Conveniently, this means that they would be intimate again at the time she is most fertile. As for the human sex drive itself, Judaism considered our nature as a struggle between two forces, the Yetzer Tov, the good inclination, which is similar to what we call conscience, our ability to distinguish right from wrong and refrain from doing wrong. The other force, the Yetzer Ra, literally the evil inclination, represents the base instincts that we share with animals, including our sexual drive. These are not evil in and of themselves. Rather, they can lead us to do evil if they are not checked by the Yetzer Tov. So the rabbis see our sex drive as a natural part of who we are, which needs to be channeled in appropriate ways. God would not have created us with this drive if it could not be put to useful purpose or purposes, in this case, both procreation and pleasure. The rabbis saw sexual intercourse as a natural part of our lives. In fact, the Talmud shares this story. Rabbi Kahana once went in and hid under Rav's bed. He heard him chatting with his wife, joking and doing what he required. It's a euphemism. Rav said to Kahana, "Are you there? Get out of here because it's rude." And his answer, "It is a matter of Torah and I need to learn." There's also a place where the Torah pays particular attention to newlyweds. When a man marries a new woman, he shall not go out with the army or be assigned to it for any purpose. He shall be exempt for 1 year for his household and cause his wife happiness. It does not say that the purpose is to bear a child, but to cause his wife happiness, to pleasure her and fulfill his obligations as her husband. Finally, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, writing about Jewish sexual ethics, concludes, "Sex is one of the gifts God has given us by creating us as we are. Like all our faculties, we can use it for good or for bad, and Judaism provides us with instruction for channeling our sexual energies toward good purpose."
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Bruce. And now we have Krista Slater, who is a senior at PLU from Fresno, California. Krista is majoring in religion and minoring in Hispanic studies and nonprofit leadership. As an active member in PLU's university congregation, Krista grew up in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and later the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. After her time at PLU, she hopes to go on to receive her master's degree in divinity from a Lutheran seminary. Krista.
Can you hear me? Awesome. I was here this morning. It was sometimes a little rough. Let me know if you can't. I'm a little uncomfortable too, so My journey to understanding faith in the context of sexuality has honestly just begun. I'd first like to share a reflection on my journey that will help explain how my time at PLU has led me to my current conclusion of Lutheran whys and what-fors of sex. My voice is not the only one. I carry both privilege and some disadvantages as a straight white woman, and I still think my voice is in this conversation is important, and I don't think it is alone. So, as Jen said, I grew up attending my grandfather's LCMS Lutheran Church, and after he retired, our whole family moved to an ELCA Lutheran Church in Fresno, California. The Central Valley is known for several things. It is really, really hot. We also produce a lot of agriculture. It's very diverse, and it is highly conservative, both politically and socially. This is why I never received sex education. Not from any of my schools, and completely unrelated, they were getting sued for lack of sex education and some abstinence-only education when I was in middle and high school. I received no direction from my family, although I seemed to know what their silence meant. And I received no direction from my church in terms of sex education, the whys and the what-fors. So really, I don't know anything. It is almost embarrassing how little I really did know about sex and reproductive health by the time I got to college. Why sex? I couldn't even understand why people wanted to have sex, like ever. I felt embarrassment from shame and lack of self-confidence. Bodies covered up at school, at church, and at the store or whatever are beautiful creation, but bodies without clothes, they're unclean. They're dirty and they're gross, and honestly, not yours, but especially mine. That's what I was feeling. Sure, when I got to PLU, I was happy to support conversations that were happening around campus, advocating for autonomy and access to things like birth control, certain events, counseling, free condoms and dental dams in all the res halls. And I put my vote where my mouth was on these issues in our school, but also when I voted for the very first time in fall 2016, because they affected other people that I deeply cared about, even if I didn't feel like it affected me at that time. I encountered the ELCA's social statement on human sexuality when I represented my church at a few of the Sierra Pacific Synod assemblies in high school. It was so bold, like, whoa, I couldn't believe it, and honestly, I couldn't get enough of it. I went to as many sessions as I could about how it affected our synod, what had changed in our church since, and how my church could get involved in things like reconciling in Christ and the conversation on it. Therefore, I do not believe the shame that I felt about talking about sex was from my church, because these are things that my church claims to believe. But my conscious and unconscious shame stemmed from being sexually abused in preschool and elementary school at a daycare my family trusted. But I don't think my community also set me up for the success or for the tools I needed by overlooking the topic, because it was too controversial to talk about human sexuality in Christianity's teachings. I was at a disadvantage then with how to talk about my experience, with my mental health, and with my self-confidence as a young person. I really could have used a mentor during those times in the church. I really could have used Bible studies on freedom and autonomy, or lessons on what Lutherans think about sex and what it is for, or like just talking about the social statements, or instruction that Jesus probably empowered and cared for many sexually abused people. But my congregation and its staff were either too conservative and caught up in the fact that our lead pastor was leaving after the 2009 human sexuality statement because it didn't agree with his theology, or they were too scared to speak up. I knew that my church cared about and served all people, but I kind of just assumed in terms of sexuality that we followed the status quo. The church should almost never follow the status quo. It wasn't until I reached PLU and began my study of Scripture and found a new community that I began to release the shame and many of the sexual social stigmas that had been ingrained in me. There have been many little moments that have helped me discover what my tradition thinks about sex and what I think about sex. Many of those moments came through my time in community with the university congregation and Pastor Jen, reading books my counselor advised me to, and my 2 biblical studies classes with Dr. Oakman. These experiences further shaped what I think the Bible says in general, and important for this panel, what I believe my tradition thinks about sex. Lutheran faith is not denial asceticism. For example, a new study says that among Protestants, Lutherans consume the most beer. Luther also wrote a lot about marriage, relationships, and even the importance of sexuality. From my new understanding about sexuality and Lutheran theology, this I have extracted that I believe that God came in a body with all the emotions and feelings of an everyday human being. Jesus was perfect, and he still got hungry, used the bathroom, threw tables around, straight up insulted people, and even though he doesn't talk exactly about sexual desire, he probably knew desire, or he at least wasn't untouched by it. Jesus is God's gift to humans, and Jesus made a new way for people to be in a right relationship with God and one another. Community and love are some of his main teachings, and he wants us to look out for our community, have all kinds of relationships that can provide us with company, help, and hope. To me, this translates over to sexual relationships as well. Sexuality is one way that we can share a relationship with another person. Sexuality is one of the most sacred ways to have a relationship with another person. It is the ultimate trust to lead another human to see you so, to let another human being see you so vulnerable. Lutherans have a hard time talking about anything. That was a joke this morning. And we have a stereotype of sitting in the final pew of the church and having little potlucks all to ourselves. This, however, is not really Lutheran after studying Lutheran theology. Martin Luther was bold in so many good and horrible ways. We need to be bolder because I think our theology calls us this way. I'm hoping that sex is an activity that God loves to see us to do, because I think it is the ultimate trust to let a human see you so physically close and vulnerable. And I think that because of my time here. I implore congregations to talk even a little more about sexuality with their students, because a little bit of awkwardness might, A, be just what anyone is looking for, and B, be the clarity someone like me really needs. Thanks.
Thank you, Krista. Dr. Joanna Gregson joined the Department of Sociology at PLU in 1998, and she was appointed our provost in 2017. Dr. Gregson teaches and conducts research in the areas of deviance, gender, and qualitative research methods. Since 2010, she has been conducting participant observation research with the authors of romance novels, examining the gendered aspects of the career and how women experience writing what has been described as the most popular, least respected genre. As a secular humanist, the core tenets of the Lutheran tradition resonate with Dr. Gregson.
Thank you. Well, after almost a decade of conducting research on the authors of romance novels, I am used to feeling like one of these kids is not like the others when I'm sitting on a panel of scholars. The feeling is certainly magnified on a panel that's part of a Lutheran Studies conference. And at first blush, you may wonder, what, other than the topic of sex, does my research have to do with the panel? Well, it turns out a lot, because faith-based romance novels are among the most popular of all the romance novels. That's right, you know this. To understand the position of faith in romance novels, a little context may be helpful for those who didn't just make sounds like they knew what I was talking about. The Romance Writers of America, or RWA, is the largest professional association of romance writers, with about 10,000 members. That's 10,000 people who are either earning a living writing romance or actively pursuing a career doing so. For the past 10 years, my co-researcher and I have been studying the authors of romance by attending RWA conferences locally and nationally, joining and participating in all that they do, conducting interviews with dozens of established and aspiring authors, editors, and publishers. In the early 2000s, the RWA Board of Directors made an important decision. While the romance novels of a few decades ago were characterized by a happily ever after ending that required marriage as an ending, in 2001, RWA officially decided that it would classify books as romance if they met two criteria. First, a central love story, and second, an emotionally satisfying, optimistic ending. The first line of what are called inspirational romances debuted shortly after the 1980 U.S. presidential election. The books were aimed at born-again Christians and were marketed in religious bookstores. In 2001, the RWA Board of Directors renamed the Christian romance subgenre inspirational romance, a nod to the association's inclusive aspirations. Authors we spoke with understood that RWA intentionally moved away from Christian to be more inclusive, but publishers largely did not follow suit. And inspirational meant then and still means Christian. RWA's latest effort to rebrand came in 2017 when they rebranded inspirational to, quote, romance with religious or spiritual elements. But publishers and authors still use inspirational, so that's the term I'll use today. The top-selling publisher in the inspirational subgenre is Harlequin Romance, which has several dedicated lines for inspirational romance alone. Their love-inspired catalog alone includes over 1,800 titles, with 6 new publications each month. Cowboys, small towns, and Amish communities are big in this line, with sample titles including, quote, Her Alaskan Cowboy, and, quote, The Amish Nanny's Sweetheart. In faith-based romance, plot A is the romance and plot B is the affirmation of faith. Publishers often have very specific guidelines regarding how faith can be referenced. One of our interviewees, a Harlequin love-inspired author, said, quote, the faith element and the character's faith has to be generic. It can't be denominationally specific. There are certain words we can't use. She said, I know several Catholic writers who can't talk about priests or the Father. They just have to say minister or pastor. Keep it very generic so it reaches a broader audience. Officially, Harlequin's submission guidelines say their books include a, quote, mandatory faith element that is integral to the story and shows rather than tells, avoiding didactic, preachy tone, or doctrinal language. Most novels in the genre focus on the hero or heroine's faith, turning the love story into what one author described as a triangle: the man and the woman, and also their relationship with God. Themes of forgiveness, honesty, and fidelity are common. Another characteristic of inspirational romance is its exclusion of other behaviors considered vices. Harlequin's submission rules say, quote, no drugs or alcohol consumption, gambling, or profanity by Christian characters. You get why that's important, okay? So to answer the question, why sex? You can probably guess that if publishers have rules about drinking, they also have rules about sex. Sex serves several purposes in these books. First, sex before or outside of marriage is often depicted as a point of conflict the hero or heroine must overcome. Thus, a story might be that a hero's sexual history and wild boy shenanigans are a turnoff to the heroine, who ultimately helps him see the error of his ways and converts him to commitment and to Jesus. And second, sex is for emotional connection and procreation, but only among married couples. So what is sex for? In inspirational romance, sex is for married couples, period. Inspirational romances are categorized as sweet romances, which is industry jargon for no sex, versus spicy, in case you're wondering, which means sex. There might be veiled references to sex that happen sometime in the hero or heroine's past, or in the epilogue of a book after the couple is married, but the door is closed and details are left out. Now, sexuality is an important part of character development and the building of a relationship. It's just depicted in very particular, very prescribed, and very heteronormative ways. Depictions of sexuality include hand-holding, cuddling, and kissing. In Amish romance, which is one of the most popular and best-selling types of inspirational romance, all physical intimacy is above the neck. In fact, in Amish romance, an important step in every relationship involves the first time a man touches a woman's hair. In every book I've read, there's a pivotal hair scene. A scene where the Amish woman removes her bonnet and the hero fantasizes about touching her hair for the first time. A scene where the woman unfurls her bun and the hero's hands accidentally touch it. Or a scene near the end of the book when intimacy is really developing, where a heroine invites a hero to brush her hair. Oh. Now, this is a good. This is an important moment to teach you something that Amish romance is often referred to in the industry as bonnet rippers. Oh. And now you know why. When I met an author of inspirational romance who wrote about Amish communities especially, I asked her about the hair scenes because I had just read one of her books and I was wondering if it was intentional. And then I read another book and it happened again. And she said it was absolutely intentional for 2 reasons. It was the accepted level of intimacy in the publisher's line and because of the biblical symbolism of hair that made it a meaningful step in a relationship. I'll conclude with a few comments about why authors write inspirational romance. Because our research is on the authors of romance, my co-researcher and I were interested in why romance in general and why this subgenre. We found that the motivations for writing in this subgenre fell into 2 categories. For some, it was a career move. As a multi-published, award-winning author of Amish romance told us, quote, "It was a business decision. It was a way to get into writing for Harlequin, which is what I wanted to do because Harlequin had the best distribution channels and the most sales. Harlequin was the best chance, I thought, for me to build a career as a writer." She went on to say, "I never would have thought, if you had told me at the time that I started writing, that I was going to become known as an inspirational writer. I would have said, 'You don't know what I was doing in the 60s, folks.' That's a real disconnect." Another author we spoke with wrote sweet romance under one pen name and romantic suspense, or spicy romance, under another because she was following the market. And that's why she writes romance in general, too, because there are so many titles published every year. One author who chose inspirational said she could sell in that line and make an income, but said, "I'm actually very glad I'm no longer writing the sexy stories, because in commercial fiction with word count limits, it gives you more words to really tell the story if you don't have to put the sex scenes in." An equal number of authors whose commitment to writing the subgenre rested in their faith background. They are storytellers who want to write stories that reflect their belief systems and will resonate and be inspiring to others. One author famously rewrote her catalog of novels, 20-plus novels, when their original copyrights expired to change the spicy to sweet, mirroring her own faith journey. Another author told us her motivation had to do with readers. "I want them to feel good after they read the book, to have a feeling of hope when they read a book. And I work really hard on the last page, so when they close the book, they go, deep sigh. That's important to me, that they feel good. That's what writing is about. And if they get a little message along the way, that's good too. And inspirational romance allows me to do that." So to conclude, as members of a society, romance authors are humans who are therefore exposed to the same social forces that exist and socialize all of us into our beliefs about sexuality and intimacy. Monetary motivations and page count aside, I think it's remarkable that authors who write inspirational romance do so because of their hope to share feel-good stories. But while not a single author spoke of the appeal of writing a sweet, sex-free romance, not a single author critiqued that constraint either. They saw no disconnect between feel-good stories and stories with no sexuality. I'll leave on that note.
Thanks, Joanna. Reverend Dr. Eric Jackson Sr. serves as the senior pastor of Bethlehem Baptist Church in Tacoma. Dr. Jackson spent over 30 years in the military, including as an Army officer. Upon completion of his tour, he became an Army chaplain and continues to minister in this and other ways today.
Thank you. I thought I would be in line with the Baptist tradition and not talk about it. No, I'm just... I do say that with a bit of jest, but truth is, the Baptist tradition I'll speak of as much as I can, and knowing that I don't speak for all Baptists. But what I do know is that we're a bit more conservative in our theology, and if truth be told, we're a little bit more liberal in our practice. I served, it's been about 10 years ago, actually my math is wrong, 20 years ago, I was a youth pastor. And one of the challenges, and I think this speaks to why we have so many problems in the church particularly, but I was a youth pastor and I did a lot of conversations around sexuality, dating and sexuality. I did a lot of conversations about abstinence even. And the challenge is we were having these conversations and the leadership of the church thought it necessary that I not talk about sex because I was putting it on their minds. My defense still did not hold much value in that my defense was, I'm not putting it on their minds when I have 2 kids who are pregnant in the congregation. But it really does speak to the challenge of the issue of sexuality. I could speak of, I think Rabbi Cadden spoke very eloquently about those particular passages that we do hold to be true in our faith. Again, we hold those things very dear to our hearts. I just don't know that we hold them as closely when it comes to the practice. I shared with our congregation in Bible study just last night that there's a difference between theory and praxis, not practice only. And the praxis is the cross between the theory of what we believe and the practice of what we believe. And we have to marry that. But the challenge is we really do have a significant matter and a significant issue as it relates to sexuality in the church. I mean, I could really just talk from the biblical perspective, but it really would be very, very theoretical only. Because all you have to do is look at the church today and realize that sex is one of the issues that tears churches apart. One, because we don't want to talk about it. 2, it's easier to quote the scripture and live differently. And I'm not going to, be very Baptist and give you the sermon of it. But it is important to note that I could really speak from what we believe, but it would really almost be hypocritical. Because all you have to do is look at the current church to realize that we're plagued by these issues of sex and sexuality. We recently had a young lady who was in a same-sex marriage send me an email via the website to ask, would I be accepted at your church? And I immediately responded out of just my own desire to embrace this person and say, absolutely yes. And even as I was writing, I wrote, absolutely yes. However, and I caught myself. I did leave the absolutely yes in the email. And I said, however, I must tell you, we hold conservative values as it relates to sex between a man and a woman. We hold conservative values as it relates to marriage. However, I will absolutely welcome you. This young lady visited the church. She did not tell me who she was initially. I kind of know because I always know who's visiting. The next Sunday, she brought her family. They had 2 boys. And the following Sunday, they actually joined the church. Good news story. They left the church because she was military as well. They left the church when her time was up in the military. And she wrote me to tell me that it was the first time she had felt at home in a very long time. Had been out of church for over 9 years. So that's the good news story. But I think as we talk about this issue, and I wanted to save a little bit of time to make sure that we were allowed time to answer questions. But the fact of the matter is, I can tell you that we are conservative in what we believe, but actually very liberal in our practice. And I think that's a really good stopping point so that we can allow more time.
Thank you. And Mark Hernandez is a senior from Las Vegas, Nevada, and uses he, him, and they, them pronouns. They are currently finishing up their degrees in communication and sociology with a concentration in film and media studies. They are spiritual in various ways and come from a Christian-based background prior to PLU. Mark?
Hello, everyone. So I just wanted to introduce myself. So Pastor Jen did mention that I come from a Christian background. My father was a pastor, and he was for most of my life, so I did grow up in a Christian household. I didn't really vibe with it, most of it growing up, and then in high school something happened, which is funny because it actually ended up being a sexual experience that made me feel like I needed to reach out for faith. And so during high school, that was when I was a youth pastor. I was giving messages. I was very involved, very volunteering. I was at the church 4 days a week, and then during that time, I was also grappling with my own queer identity and understanding what my identity meant and what did it mean in this church that says it's okay to not be okay. but then in like parentheses, but it's not okay to stay that way. And so how did I move forward with that when I knew that I was not going to be a male with a female in a partnered relationship? And so when asked like the question of why sex, for me, it came down to what is sex about? And so I kind of broke it down into 4 categories in my own head, but I also want to preface saying that this is not by any means like a blanket statement that can be pawned for all people who like are spiritual or are not Christian, but I thought of it as exploration, pleasure, intimacy, and capital. And so I want to talk about exploration because for me as a queer identifying person, that exploration isn't always granted to you, and not just for the queer community too, but if you are female identifying or feminine presenting, that exploration of your own body and of your own sexuality is not something that you are granted the like capacity to do, especially growing up and coming from a religious background that was constantly being policed, not just for myself, but also for my 5 sisters. And it's a lot, I know. And then, so the other thing was pleasure. So I was also talking to my peers and I was like, all right, well, why do you have sex? You know, like we are like the young people that people talk about, like the sexual revolution and things like that. Why do you have sex? And a lot of times I got responses of pleasure. Like it's fun. Like why not? Like just for like some kicks and laughs. But the more I began to like dive into like what's that pleasure mean? What does it mean to us? It became more about intimacy. And intimacy comes in more than just, you know, like cuddling. It can be like a conversation at 3 a.m. Sometimes it is sex. But for many people, it's that intimate act of being with someone and having that like skin-on-skin contact. And that is a very intimate thing that you want to share with a person or multiple people. And then I also wanted to mention capital. And so I wanted to broaden the term and talk about what capital means. And so when I thought about it, something that is not brought into the conversation a lot is also sex work. So why sex? Sex is also a means of survival. It's a means of like capital and like monetary capital, making money. And also in various communities, specifically like the communities that are also queer, like cutie pop communities, sorry. I'm like trying to break down cutie pop, but it's like not working in my head. Queer, trans, people of color. The cutie pop community specifically, that is something that is very prevalent where you have to have sex as a means of survival, or maybe you were not granted the ability to explore yourself sexually, and that is why you are having sex, to explore yourself, to explore others, to be intimate. And so then there's also the what is sex for? And so I also wanted to dive into or just talk about what it is for in terms of like consensual pleasure and having intimacy with another person. And also I want to talk about how with the specific like queer community, when you're asked like what is sex for, you don't know yet, you know? Like sometimes you're like, what is sex? How do you have sex? Sexual education isn't the most like concise and you don't really get everything that you need to. And if you're a queer person, it's like, good luck, here's the internet. So when I think of like what is sex for me, it has social significance. You have to explore yourself. You have to be intimate with one another. It leads to healing and experiences that can't be understood in a vacuum. You don't just have sex, you know? You're having sex with another person, and when you're entering into that state, you are bringing something there, and they are also bringing something there. And it's a matter of like exchanging that energy, and you're leaving with something of theirs, and they are leaving with something of yours. And so something too is that sex can be vilified in a lot of ways, especially for women and especially for queer people. And if you're like a queer woman of color, it's like, that's rough. And society lets you know how rough that really is every day. And something that I think is funny too is that I'm from like Las Vegas, right? Sin City. Like everyone's just like wilding out. But that's not the case, where Nevada is actually a pretty conservative state. Las Vegas being like the more like progressive, like liberal hotspot, but as a whole, Nevada's pretty conservative. Sexual education, I was taught to be abstinent in middle school and high school. And it's just unrealistic in many ways, because some people want to explore that before marriage. And there is the true love waits kind of thing, you know? And that resonates with a lot of people, and that's great if it does resonate with you. I think my point is not to be critiquing individual people and their individual faiths. For me, I think that it's okay to critique the institution and the way religion has shaped our mentality about sex and sexual experiences. And sex does not determine someone's value. It never should. Whatever your number is, doesn't matter, you know? What matters is your intimate connection with that person, and if they are also in that intimate kind of way connected to you, because it is a connection. And that's where I'm coming from in terms of faith and spirituality. Are any of you familiar with soul ties or that kind of thing? Yeah, so that's what I was also kind of touching on of soul ties, of when you are having sex, you are bringing that energy to one another, and it impacts you. I remember the first time I had a sexual experience. That first sexual experience still impacts me to this day, and I still carry a part of that experience with me. But I don't let it bring me down and bring down my own worth, regardless of who's saying what, and maybe people telling me that I can't have sex because of this, or I'm not married yet. For me personally, I think that I wouldn't want to marry someone that I don't know is also I don't also want to have sex with. I feel like if I'm going to get into a marriage where I'm pleasure and bring the happiness, things like that, right? You gotta know how to give the happiness too. My personal opinion. So I just wanted to end on what I mentioned earlier of sex not having to value your worth and who you are, regardless of your social identity and positionality in society, and also regardless of the different institutions that are telling you that you need to look a certain way, be a certain way, have sex a certain way within media or education, within your family. All these institutions trying to tell you how to be you, when really you just need to have your own bodily autonomy, and you get to choose what you do with your own body and who you get to share it with, whether that brings you pleasure or intimacy or capital, or maybe it's just you exploring yourself or exploring another person. Either way, I think sex is something that should be talked about more. Thank you.
We've got about 5.5 minutes for questions. I would love to ask students that I'm going to give you first dibs on asking questions. We've got 2 microphone carriers. Please do use the microphone. It's an access issue. And as my partner says, trumpet, not ice cream cone. Okay? Your chin doesn't talk. So this way, when you're holding a microphone so we can all hear. Tight questions. Students, you're first.
Hello.
Hello.
My question is for the rabbi here. What do rabbis in Jewish tradition say about premarital sex and homosexuality?
Wow, 5 minutes. So, from a traditional point of view, both of those were outside the bounds. However, in modern Jewish thought and practice, both of them in committed relationships are acceptable. And if I had more time, I could go in a lot more, but I think to leave time for more questions, leave it at that.
Maybe they'll mingle during break time if you have other questions.
Sure.
Other folks, students.
Okay, my question is for, was it Reverend Jackson? Is that? Okay, yes. Hi, I'm on the east side too, so. Hi. Yeah, nice to meet you, neighbor. So my question for you is that curious part of having, for me it's curious, of having can you explain some more about the difference between being conservative with the belief part and then also the practice being a way much more liberal, and the acceptance and then maybe not so much acceptance. If you could go into that just a little bit more. Maybe just another anecdote. You gave one. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
I would hate to speak for the church, but one of the things, when I say conservative in our views, it is in line with what we understand the Bible to say about sex between and marriage between a man and a woman. And we I think, is that right? I think you used the term vilify. I think we have actually used the Bible to vilify those who are not in line with our views. So when I say conservative, I mean to the point of condemning those who don't hold the same values. I do know, however, that we say that, And we believe that, just as we believe other things of the Bible. One of the things that I teach, and I'm very passionate about, is that we will take a thing, and we can call it sex in this moment. We can take a thing that we do believe or we don't believe, and we will hold that while at the same time violating and breaking every other thing that we hold to be true as well. And what happens is we begin to be vocal on those things that we don't do and silent on the things that we do. So when I say conservative, it's conservative in our theology in that we hold and we believe what the Bible says as it relates to our understanding of the Bible, saying that sex is between a man and a woman. However, if it's some other things that we don't necessarily do, then we don't really speak to those things. So that's more the liberal part of the practice. I hope that kind of said it. I know that was, yeah.
One more question.
Hi, my question is actually also for the Reverend.
Okay.
What I'm curious about, in a lot of Christian traditions, sex is intertwined with this concept of shame because it's not talked about and it's not brought into the light, and there's a lot that goes unsaid and a lot that people struggle with, like kind of in the dark by themselves. How would you recommend approaching those ideas of shame when they've really been deeply rooted?
One of the things that I've done, and I'm in the midst of doing now, is really saying that we have to have a paradigm shift in our theology and our practice as well. The church has done a really poor job of allowing people to talk about issues that matter. This is one of those issues that really matter. So consequently, people struggle in silence. And we're talking about sex, but really there's a host of issues that we really struggle with silently. And all I would say is it requires the church, whatever the institution is, it requires the church to have someone in position, particularly the pastor, that doesn't mind breaking the traditions. I think someone said that, was it you, Krista, that the church should not follow the status quo. And I think you're absolutely right. Martin Luther was one of those ones that had an absolutely challenging time with the church, the people of the church, and all of the things that the church believed at the time. And I know for myself, I had, when I first got married, I was like, no R&B at my reception and no dancing. And then about 10 years in the ministry, I'm like, man, I denied my wife all of that. How foolish was I? And of course now, I mean, I still don't do a whole lot of stuff. I'm still pretty old school as it relates to that. But even True Love Waits conference, you mentioned True Love Waits. I taught, for about 6 years, I taught at a True Love Waits conference. It was a teen conference. And the whole premise of the conference was about abstinence. But invariably, there were young ladies that would show up pregnant at every conference that I taught. And I had to start the conference saying, I'm going to level the playing field. Let's pretend that no one has had sex. But it was really, it didn't matter to say that because the fact of the matter is more than half of the people in the room probably had.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. It was
No, you're good. This is a hard and vulnerable and kind of hilarious sometimes and really important topic. So I want to thank each of our panel members for their generosity